Hello. Hiya.
Góðan daginn og velkominir hingað í Vísindaportið. Við erum með gesti sem hlusta á streymi. So I will make the introduction both in Icelandic and English. Gestur okkar í dag er David Cook, Dr. David Cook. Hann er að kynna rannsóknir á vegum ARCPath verkefnisins ARCPath stendur fyrir Arctic Climate Predictions, Pathways to Resilient Sustainable Societies. And guess why I have this in written form, guess why I remember all that. Og það verkefni vistkerfisþjónustu hvala. David er nýdoktor við Háskóla Íslands og beinast rannsóknir hans að vistkerfisþjónustu hvala á norðurslóðum. David kennir líka við Háskóla Íslands í umhverfishagfræði og kennir hér hjá okkur núna námskeið í Resource Economics and Policy hér í Háskólasetri. Í nýlegri doktorsrannsókn sinni skoðaði David reyndar ekki vistkerfisþjónustu hvala, heldur vistkerfisþjónustu sem var rætur sínar að rekja til jarðhitasvæða og notaði hann skilyrta matsaðferð til að meta viljan til þess að fjármagna verndun slíkra svæða á Íslandi. Og svona orð eins og skilyrta matsaðferð, það I don't even find it in English any longer. The contingent evaluation method, yeah. So í öðrum nýlegum rannsóknum hans hefur hann sjónum beint til að mynda á sjálfbærni umhverfis og áhættustjórnun á norðurslóðum. And now I know that most of the public here is not Icelandic speaking, so you get the same again. David Cook will present research activities on the ARCPath project concerning the ecosystem service of Wales. David is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Iceland, linked to the ARCPath project, and ARCPath stands for Arctic Climate Predictions, Pathways to Resilient Sustainable Societies. He is teaching at the University of Iceland in environmental economics and is teaching a course here in Resource Economics and Policy at University Center of Westfjords. His research at the moment concerns on ecosystem services associated with whales, and we will get this lecture here exactly on this topic. Thank you, David, for being here and being willing to come to the Vísindaport while you're teaching here.
So, good afternoon. Firstly, to the people, the Ísafjörður, the public who have come along today, thank you very much for showing interest. And also to the students I've been teaching this week in Resource Economics and Policy. It's great to see so many of you here. And another thing I should say before I go any further is that I am just one researcher in this project, and there are many, many different partners. And at the University of Iceland, we have a small team focused on this topic, the ecosystem services of whales in the Arctic. And I also have a colleague who is doing her PhD in this subject, Laura Malinowskaite, who some of you may have met, who are at the Arctic Circle Assembly, and also my boss, Brynhildur Davíðsdóttir. Some of you may have heard of her, even if you're not from Reykjavik, for her work to do with climate change policy in Iceland. And also an environmental anthropologist is part of our team, Helga Ögmundardóttir, and an environmental risk analyst, Laura Jóhannsdóttir. So we have many people in our team. And another point I should maybe make before I go any further is that this term, ecosystem services of whales, what ecosystem services are, they're merely benefits that human beings receive from whales, and they can take many different forms, particularly in the Arctic. So what we're doing in our part of the study is exploring the different dimensions of benefits that people receive in the Arctic. And we're thinking, firstly, what they are, and secondly, we're thinking how to value those benefits, and thirdly, we're thinking in terms of management and policy, how best to manage those different benefits. And we do so through various case studies. And some of our research is already published, has been published in some cases as recently as last week, and some of it is forthcoming. It's going to be published hopefully next year. So I'll talk about both of those, but I'll focus mainly on the published research at the moment that focuses on whales. And we also have aspects of this project that don't relate to whales, aspects that relate to tourism in the Arctic, industrial developments in the Arctic, and trade-offs connected to that. So I'll also, at the end of the lecture, I'll also just mention what else we're doing in this project that might be of interest. So the ArcPath project, as has been stated by Peter, this is a project that focuses on interlinkages overall. It looks at climate change impacts in the Arctic, and then it tries to link those impacts ultimately to the changes in human well-being, particularly linked to resources such as whales. And I suppose our focus on whales is because of their charisma. They've been said to have charismatic megafauna. So they're an interesting subject to focus on because of their attractiveness, because of their beauty, because of their intrigue. And they are very popular in many different ways in the Arctic, not least because communities rely on them in many places for sustenance, and others benefit in more economic, modern ways. So increasingly in Iceland, we have seen the emergence of whale watching. But we see this too in places where they're also focused on sustenance. So much of our research in recent times has focused on Greenland, where they're developing whale watching and relying on sustenance at the same time. So I just want to to give more background to the ArcPath project and say where our parts of the research fit in. So the first part is work package 1. That looks at Arctic climatic and sociological linkages. Much of that is focused on climate change in the Arctic in the past. The second part is looking at global climate predictions. So that's non-specific to the Arctic. And then the third part involves downscaling to the Arctic context. And that work is quite heavily evolved now and is going to come to some kind of fruition, hopefully next year. And where we fit in is in work package 4, looking perhaps at some of the implications of climate change in the Arctic in relation to firstly how people benefit from resources, but also issues to do with governance, adaptation and responsible development. And the program director, the Coastal Marine Management Masters here, Catherine Chambers, she is also part of the project and works in this part of the project linked to management, adaptation, social effects, particularly linked to fisheries policy in her case. We're not just focused on whales in this project. They are the lens through which we analyse environmental change at the University of Iceland. And if you want to learn more about the project, then the web link is available there. So as I say, we have many partners in this project. It's not just the University of Iceland. We have the University of Tromsø, we have the Danish Meteorological Institute, the Swedish version, INSTAR in the US, University of Bergen is part of it. I don't think they're shown on this chart, but also Royal Roads University in Canada, the Husavik Research Centre into Marine Mammals, and more focused on the biological side. So we have many, many partners, and we're all trying to collaborate and come to some interesting study outcomes. There are 3 main objectives: climate predictions, increased understanding of how climate interacts with multiple societal factors. As we say, our focus is on whales, and then improving predictions of the climate and how that linked with these environmental, social, and economic effects, leading to hopefully new knowledge on potential pathways to action as an outcome in 2021. So what do whales have to do with this? Well, we fit in, as I say, within work package 4, and we have 5 main study areas. So we're looking to some extent at the impact of increased marine tourism and marine traffic on marine mammals. We're looking at what the various ecosystem services of whales are, whether there are some trade-offs between those services. So in Iceland, we've had heated debate at times between whale watching and whaling. It's an example of a trade-off. The changing sociological systems in the Arctic, particularly with respect to climate change, and how we might manage these marine ecosystems better. So here's some examples of those trade-offs in Iceland. These are from the English language media literature. So from 2014, and whale hunting and whale watching cannot coexist within Faxafloy Bay, says local tour operator. Whale watching tourists observe whalers at work. And this is quite relevant to the second part of this presentation, where we look at the whale sanctuary in Faxafloy Bay, where which is an area that is designated as a place where you cannot conduct commercial whaling. And there's an area just the other side of a line where you can conduct commercial whaling. So there's the potential for people in the whale sanctuary who are undertaking whale watching trips to witness some sort of whale cull and what that means. So that the trade-off there is literally from one side of a line to another. Okay, so this is more for the benefit of the students who've been taking the class this week. I wanted to try and show the links between how we form research questions and then some of the methods that we actually adopt to try and answer those. So I won't go into all of the core themes, but I'll just focus on the research questions. So first of all, we wanted to know what has been written on the topic so far. So this was done generally in terms of looking at Arctic ecosystem services, and it's done specifically in terms of whale ecosystem services. So we also want to consider how people benefit from and value the various ecosystem services of marine mammals in the Arctic. We do that through some theoretical work, and we also do it through case studies. What are the different social groups that co-produce and use the ecosystem services of marine mammals, and how are these distributed? So we're looking there at things to do with equity and fairness, about who receives the benefits of whale ecosystem services, how these have been managed to date, and what are their trajectories for future management? What are the actors and institutions involved? So for instance, in connection with codes of conduct for whale watching, who's responsible for developing those? Could they be stronger? Who might be responsible for making them stronger, making them mandatory perhaps? 5, how can the valuation of whale ecosystem services be used to inform decision-making processes and the governance of marine protected areas? And we focus specifically in the published work to date on the Faxafloe Bay Whale Sanctuary, which is one case study, but we also have 3 main case studies where we've been going out and conducting qualitative research in the main, some quantitative too, but mainly qualitative. So the first is Husavik in the north of Iceland, the second is Andenes, the northern tip of Norway, and the third is Disco Bay off the west coast of Greenland. So Husavik itself, it's the self-proclaimed whale watching capital of Europe. This is quite a claim. In fact, I might argue it's not even the whale watching capital of Iceland, because more people go whale watching in Reykjavik actually than in Husavik. But certainly, you can say without any debate that the whale is central to the town, to its economy, to its identity these days. And it's located near Skjaldundur Bay in the northeast of Iceland, and there are many species of whale that are visible, including since 2003 again the blue whale, if you're lucky. So whale watching there has taken place since the mid-1990s. It started in 1995, and it's been a main diversification industry since the decline of the fishing industry. The second case study is Andenes in Norway. This is the self-proclaimed whale watching capital of the Arctic Circle. It's actually within the Arctic, and it has many similarities to Husavik. Apart from the fact that fishing hasn't declined in this town, it did have a military air base there, which is in decline. So it suffered the decline of that industry. Main species there are again quite wide-ranging, but mostly focused on sperm whales. And whale watching again since the 1990s. Similarly to Husavik, they have a whale museum. In Andenes, they have plans for a big exhibit called The Whale. At Greenland, Disco Bay, main town there is Ilulissat, which is the 3rd largest settlement in Greenland. And in this region, they conduct indigenous whaling, and they also increasingly operate whale watching tourism as well, especially out of Ilulissat. We also visited Disco Island, a small town called Keketasuak, where there is maybe the center of indigenous whaling. And also we visited a town called Asiat, where there's a mixture of whale watching and also some whale watching tourism too. So one of the things we've been considering in this project are all of the various benefits of whales. And I've kind of talked about this with the students this week. And then we have to consider how to value them. You can take the approach of environmental economists, which is to value changes to the environment using money, a concept called willingness to pay. Or sometimes you can take an alternative approach, which doesn't involve money. Money has certain limitations, has strengths, it's familiar, it's something we're used to involving ourselves with, but it has weaknesses too, particularly in connection when we have values that are formed collectively, things like community identity, things like spiritual relationships with environmental resources, whales, and things like myths and legends and those kinds of things. To value those using monetary information is particularly not just complicated, but also controversial. Some would say unethical. So one of the things we've been doing is sketching out the various benefits that people receive from ecosystem services, and then applying these and observing how they relate to the particular case studies. We group these according to 3 categories: provision, services, regulating and maintenance, and cultural. And you can see that most of the ecosystem services fall within this cultural dimension. So tourism, music and arts, inspiration for those, education in the form of museums particularly, spiritual enrichment, particularly in indigenous societies, community identity. Husavik would be a classic example of how a community has changed its identity because of an environmental resource. Aesthetics, just the appreciation of a whale, and a concept called non-use value, which is the existence of whales. And then there are other more biological services that we focus on less. Much of our focus is on the social and the cultural aspect at the University of Iceland, but these are no less important. Things to do with climate regulation. The whale can act as a store of carbon, particularly when it dies and falls to the ocean floor. Things to do with biodiversity, enhanced primary production, nutrient cycling. And of course, in many places, the whale is still central as a food product. Less so today in Iceland, less so today in Norway, but still to some extent, but critical in some remote communities in Greenland where the alternative food sources are quite sparse. So one study that we've been looking at specific to Iceland is we've been doing an economic valuation study, and this is the study that was published just last week. And we were looking at the Faxaflói Bay Whale Sanctuary, the area where you are not allowed to currently kill whales, and it's roughly the size of 1/3 of the bay. And we were wondering, given that a lot of people in Iceland seem to be against whaling, in actual fact, it does not always turn out that a lot of people are, but it seemed that way at the time, how much would they be willing to sacrifice in order to expand the sanctuary? In other words, to make the sanctuary the full scale of the bay, to double it or triple it in size. So we use a method called contingent valuation. It's an approach that is survey-based. And although it's more complicated than I'm going to explain here, essentially you ask people how much they are willing to sacrifice, how much money they're willing to pay to expand the bay. And from that, you can gauge some kind of estimate of the benefits of actually expanding the bay. You might be able to inform decision makers in a language that they understand, money, about the merits of actually doing so or not, as the case may be. What we find from the study is we reiterate findings that have been reported in other opinion polls, which are that Icelanders are divided on the issue of whaling. There is fairly limited willingness to pay. 30% of people were willing to pay, but actually that matches quite closely with the proportion of people in Iceland who want to end whaling. About 1/3 of people in Iceland want to end whaling. So it's maybe not as low as it first appears. And our mean willingness to pay was about 5,000 Icelandic krona per person. So we asked people, are they willing to pay an additional tax for the expansion of the whale sanctuary? So currently the sanctuary is this size. We were asking whether they would be willing to expand it all the way across to the southern tip of the western part of Snæfellsnes near Hetna. And we found that 99 people were willing to pay and 225 were not. We also asked a lot of interesting attitudinal data, which may be of as much relevance as the monetary outcome. We asked people whether whaling was important for the Icelandic economy, and 50% of people disagreed with that. And this was conducted before there was a study by the Institute of Economic Studies in Iceland that showed that whaling is a continual loss-making industry in Iceland and has been for many years. We also asked whether whale watching is important for the Icelandic economy, and in contrast, 48% of people agreed with that. And actually, that is despite in recent years whale watching also being a loss-making industry in Iceland, mainly because it has had to try and accommodate or keep up with the growth of the tourism industry in Iceland, and has had to purchase more boats, which are very expensive, which means in the short term at least, it has become a loss-making industry. That may change in the future. Then we asked people whether they are for or against whaling. In the top pie chart there, we find that 36% of people are for whaling, 38% against. So it's very mixed, it's very divided. And then there's a large group of people who are either of no fixed opinion or do not care. But when we ask them specifically, are they against fin whaling or minke whaling, the two types of whaling that take place in Iceland, we find that more people are actually against fin whaling than minke whaling, 42% against fin whaling and only 33% in the case of minke whaling. And probably that's because fin whales are actually endangered globally. Even if they're not maybe endangered in Icelandic waters in the global sense, they are endangered. And minke whales are not listed as endangered, so perhaps that has influenced their outcome. Then we asked people why they were willing to pay, why they were not willing to pay, and 41% of people in the left table were against whaling in Faxafloy Bay, and 37% believed that there was some kind of environmental benefits from expanding the sanctuary. Those people who were not in favour, they wanted whaling in the most case, 57%, 128 people in favour of whaling, and some were concerned about the potential for increased whale watching in the area, which has been shown in some places to have a negative impact on the behaviour of whales, to cause them stress. So those were the outcomes from that study. Then we have, I want to talk about briefly some ongoing work before returning to Faxafloy Bay and another study we've conducted there. Of course, as I said, monetary valuation is only one approach. Often non-monetary valuation is best and a good way of working out how a community values a particular resource, such as whales. So we've been conducting what's called socio-cultural valuation of ecosystem services, and it involves many methods. And the challenge is not really to conduct the individual methods, but how you integrate the information at the end. That is going to be our hard part. We spent 2 weeks in Husavik last summer and this summer, a week each, conducting non-participant observation of the community. That's a kind of more a form of ethnographic research. We've conducted 18 interviews of an hour or longer with identified stakeholders linked to both the whale watching industry and the whale in general. And we've conducted preference surveys this summer, looking at how people value the different ecosystem services of whales and how strongly they do. And we got 580 responses to those. We haven't analysed any of this data yet. That is for January. So some of the main findings that we expect, we expect to look into different values in Husavik connected to whales among different types of people. We want to glean perceptions and attitudes about whale ecosystem services, and to gain some information about socioeconomic needs and management linked to whales in this small community. We have managed to identify various ecosystem services specific to Husavik. Tourism and recreation were most dominant, then knowledge and education, and so on. Most of the services, again, were cultural services that were dominant in this community. Regulating services were considered to be relatively less important. Some of the values attributed to whale ecosystem services that we'll explore more when we write this up are economic, the socially formed ones such as community identity, the ones linked to education, aesthetics and the beauty, and then existence. This study, the preference survey in this summer in Husavik, followed on from a pilot study that we conducted in Andenes the previous summer when we were in northern Norway. And there we asked people, again, on a scale of 0 to 5, how important various ecosystem services were. And we did this just with a small sample of 15, just to see how this approach worked. And what came out was that recreation and tourism in Andenes was by far the most dominant service, or most important to the stakeholders, with a mean of 4.93. And again, it had become important, the whale had become a central part of community and cultural identity with a mean of 4. And the relatively less significant services were, again, the regulating services. And perhaps this is because, not so much that they are unimportant, but because various stakeholders have little information about their value. They have a deficit in terms of understanding how biology functions in relation to whale ecosystems. So we shouldn't just completely ignore them because of an outcome such as this. Food products were very insignificant because there is no consumption of whale or whaling taking place in the Andenes region of northern Norway. So I want to come back now to Faxafloy. And at the end of the valuation study that we actually completed this in end of 2018, even though it's only just been published now. But we were reflecting on the concept of the whale sanctuary, and we were thinking, what does a whale sanctuary mean? It sounds like it's something wonderful, something pristine, or something sustainable, certainly something that probably should be conserved or should be preserved. And in practice, we had an early feeling that this wasn't necessarily the case, that actually whale sanctuaries were being adopted around the world in ways that didn't really meet any kind of standards in relation to ecological sustainability or in any way considerate of the needs of the people using those areas. So we decided to look into what sanctuaries do in practice. Are they protected areas or are they not? Or they are, in the sense that they ban commercial whaling, but that's as far potentially as they go. And you actually have to go back to the International Whaling Commission's definition of a whale sanctuary way back in 1948 to realize that it is only an area that ends commercial whaling. It has no broader objectives than that. If a whale sanctuary does have a broader objective than that, it's because of some other legislation that has ensured that it goes further. So what we wanted to do was to look at various whale sanctuaries and to consider the extent to which they adopt a best practice standard for preservation, for conservation, for sustainability in the marine environment. And that standard is ecosystem-based management, which is an objective of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 14, life on water. And what is ecosystem-based management, and to what extent do various whale sanctuaries fulfill the criteria of marine ecosystem-based management? So I say there, it's actually current ongoing case study-based research. I haven't updated the slide appropriately. It is completed. And I want to just define marine ecosystem-based management. It's an integrated approach to management that considers the entire ecosystem, including humans. The goal of EBM is to maintain an ecosystem in a healthy, productive, and resilient condition so that it can provide the services humans want to need. Those services are those ecosystem services that I was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. We also had to work out what are the various dimensions of marine ecosystem-based management, and it's not something that is easy to measure. Certainly you can't do in a precise quantitative way, but you can maybe approximate some outcomes. And we found a study by the author Long and others in 2015, where he had gone through the literature on marine ecosystem-based management, and he had tried to identify the most common principles in relation to the concept. And he came up with 15. And from left to right, they increase in importance. I would not suggest that this is a perfect way of evaluating marine ecosystem-based management. Indeed, there is some duplication, for instance. So one example would be that the use of scientific knowledge is, of course, a necessary feature in considering ecosystem connections. So there's some duplication. But as a way of getting a general feel, it proved to be quite useful. And the actual paper was also published about 2 months ago. It's quite wordy. It goes into quite a lot of detail for each of these case studies. We have 6. I just want to really probably focus maybe again on Faxaflowy Bay, given the time that we have available. And you find that it falls short of acceptable standards in terms of marine ecosystem-based management. It does acknowledge uncertainty, but only in the sense that it bans the main activity there, whaling. That is how it acknowledges uncertainty. It doesn't have appropriate monitoring, really, of what goes on in that bay, we find. It lacks interdisciplinarity. Oh, that's not so good. I don't want to change the color scheme. It's bright enough, right? It fails to recognize the links between social and ecological systems. It doesn't really have any kind of management plan. That's its main fault, I would say. In that sense, it cannot account for things like the changing ecosystem dynamics, impacts such as climate change. It fails really to consider sustainability, apart from the fact that it ends commercial whaling in the area. It's not been based on any kind of stakeholder involvement. It is in effect a political tool set up by the government. It's not been put out to any kind of consultation, either to the public or related affected NGOs perhaps. So it doesn't rely on scientific knowledge, and it cannot really adapt into the future. So it has many flaws, and these flaws are actually very similar to the IWC, the International Whaling Commission's large-scale whale sanctuaries, which are the ones in the Indian Ocean and Southern Ocean. So when sanctuaries are defined in accordance with how they interpret a whale sanctuary to be, they tend to fall short. Oops. But when they have broader objectives, such as in America, in Hawaii, where marine protected area legislation is much more stringent, much stronger, then they tend to do better. Then they tend to also encompass things such as indigenous values, stakeholder knowledge. They have management plans that they update every 5 years, typically. And in Ninginganik, and for those of you who were at the Arctic Circle Assembly, I talked about this in a bit more detail. In Ninginganik, they are quite strong in terms of how they ensure that Indigenous peoples are part of the management and the knowledge gathering process in terms of guiding the design of the whale sanctuary there. So we can see that whale sanctuaries, typically, they fall short, but they can potentially do better. And no whale sanctuary yet actually meets the standard of ecosystem-based management. So some of the other things that we're doing that are ongoing in the last few minutes, we're looking into management and the trade-offs of whale ecosystem services in more detail. We've conducted stakeholder mapping for each of our 3 main case studies, Husavik, Andenes, and Disco Bay. In June 2008, we conducted the fieldwork in Husavik, and in Andenes and Norway was in September 2018. And we've, in connection with that, we did a total of 33 interviews. And then in August 2019, we did the preference valuation survey in Husavik. And then in the 2 weeks after that, we did 19 interviews in Disco Bay with people linked to both whale watching and whaling, so including Indigenous hunters, full-time and part-time, licensing authorities linked to hunting, people expanding into tourism linked to whale watching, people in the tourism industry, people who are being inspired to do art because of whales in Disco Bay, etc. And that process will culminate in the transcription and analysis of those interview data and various articles. So there'll be this socio-cultural evaluation in Husavik that I mentioned. There'll be a paper looking at the management implications in all 3 main case studies and generalizing those implications to how whales should best be managed in the Arctic. There's also a study I'm working on now looking at recreational whale watching of tourists in Reykjavik, looking not just at how much they pay economically to go whale watching, but having had the whale watching experience, how much would they have been prepared to pay in addition, potentially, to what they did pay? And we're finding probably that not many people are willing to pay extra for whale watching in Reykjavik. And then, not related to whales, one thing that we're going to be doing in January, February is looking at the concept of systemic risk of cruise ships in the Arctic. Not just looking at the environmental implications, but some of the social and economic implications of cruise ships in the Arctic, and also things called domino effects. How one negative incident linked to a cruise ship in the Arctic could lead to a spiral of events and risks that go far greater than the initial incident itself. So I think I had just a couple more slides. So this is some of the published ArcPath work to date. I know these slides are available for the students here. I don't know if they'll be made available for anyone else if they're interested. Published a study looking at systemic risk in maritime oil spills in general in the Arctic. We looked at ecosystem services in the Arctic, a thematic review, just what's been studied to date and the opportunities and the gaps for further analysis. This paper that I talked about, whale sanctuaries, an analysis of their contribution to marine ecosystem-based management. The willingness to pay study in Faxafloy Bay. We've also been doing work looking in the Arctic context in relation to tourism, synergies and trade-offs and the sustainable development goals, the implications of the Icelandic tourism sector. And then we have a forthcoming paper, hopefully it's going to be accepted soon, it's in review, valuing the ecosystem services of whales. That's a theoretical study looking at how we should value these benefits as social scientists. So I think that's about half an hour, hopefully, so I'm on time. So if you have any questions, then please ask, or suggestions, comments, criticisms. Yes.
Hi. I was in Husavik this summer doing my research for my thesis. So I was out on the whale watching boats and I was looking into how whale watching impacts whales' behavior and also a little bit into how the companies are following the code of conduct.
That's interesting.
Yeah, and I was quite surprised that the code of conduct is not taken very seriously, especially
I feel the same from my experiences there.
Yeah.
I mean, it's written on the notice boards in the various companies, and we'll say
it's just kind of like a general guideline.
I do not feel when you actually go on the whale watching boat that they actually follow it at all, is my experience. I was on a boat where they were chasing whales very closely, and I was quite concerned about that. Yeah. So if you're saying that my experience is the normal experience, then that's
so I'm wondering if Iceland is shifting from whaling to whale watching, how
Yeah.
can Iceland have sustainable whale watching without an enforced
Absolutely.
code of conduct?
Well, one thing I didn't mention, we have a master's student in our project called Renee. She actually visited here quite recently. And she's looking at how the code of conduct can be made more powerful, potentially have some actual teeth and enforcement, and who should enforce that. So yeah, I definitely think it has some limitations. But also in Norway and in Greenland, they don't actually have a code of conduct in Greenland, but in Norway they have a almost the same one as Iceland. And again, it's very loosely applied. The only place I know whether they've actually enshrined it in law is in Sri Lanka. They have that's part of the legal process there. So might be something worth looking at. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
So we know that whaling in Iceland is losing business. Why is it still happening?
It happens because, this is my opinion, it happens because of very powerful lobbying interests, namely Christian Lofsson's company, Kvalur EHF. He is a multi-billionaire in Iceland, and he has a very powerful effect over politicians and even academics who have written reports saying that whaling should continue. And there was earlier this year, there was a decision to extend the quota in Iceland for 5 years to 2023. And this was a surprise to many people. We thought the quota would be ending in Iceland because of the loss-making industry. But just before, there was a report that came out by the Institute of Economic Studies, just in the corridor adjacent to where I work. And they said that whaling in Iceland was, although it was loss-making, it should be encouraged over whale watching in Faxafloy Bay because of the higher wages that people in whaling earn. And then this report was cited by Christian Thor Juliusson, I forget his name precisely, the fisheries minister, and then the quota was extended. So there are people with powerful interests, I think, in Iceland who want this to continue. And why do they want it to continue when it's loss-making, even though they are losing money? I think it's a national sovereignty issue. I think Lofsson has belonged to a family of whalers, and to him it's a right to whale. It's a thing that he expects to be able to do. So, yeah, this is just my opinion. But yeah,
how big is the loss of the whaling industry? I mean, how much money is this?
But
is it similar to the loss of Morgunblaðið, which is roughly 400 million per year, or is it
400 million Icelandic krona?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just picking that comparison up because that's been one of the loss-making industries that are supported by some of the fishing industry. But I mean, I'm just wondering, like, how much money is a businessman willing to lose over a long period of time, just for those reasons that you mentioned. I find that very strange.
Yeah, it does seem irrational, doesn't it, on the face of it? But bear in mind, he does make money elsewhere. So the losses of the scale you're talking about in relation to Morgunblaðið, I can't remember the precise figure, but it's in that ballpark. And bear in mind, he has made a lot of money at the same time through things like investing in fishing companies and having shares in things like HB Brandy and that kind of thing. So he is not loss-making as an individual. He is just offsetting in a way. So you can question it, but he has received a lot of international coverage for his attitudes. You can go on YouTube and you can see things about Christian Lofsson and whaling and the controversy and things like that. So I think he to some extent enjoys that attention, maybe.
I mean, do they expect to turn it into a profitable? I mean, is there something in the cards that says, okay, this? I mean, like what you mentioned about the whale watching industry, which is a loss.
Yeah,
because of investment, I guess.
So in the long term, it won't be. Well, here's the thing: they actually did not take up any of their quota this year, and so that's a good thing for those who want to protect whales. And the reason was that their export market, Japan, has just left the International Whaling Commission so that it can take part in its own commercial whaling. So they were selling them at whale meat before to Japan. That was the only real market in the main. And now they've lost that market. So there's no economic, even less economic argument for actually whaling. So this year they did not whale. So we do not know what they will do next year, but they would have to find a new market for their product. And Iceland is not going to be that market because there is insufficient consumption. So.
Right.
I don't know much about the Icelandic tax system, but I know in the US, a lot of times businesses will invest in something that they enjoy, and then even though it's turning a loss, they'll write those losses off. So I wasn't sure if that's something here would be something as well, where you could, get the identity benefit of it and the popularity while simultaneously getting a financial benefit by running.
I think that's exactly how it would be here too. It would be. I don't know the detail of the sort of companies that are owned by this person, but I would be surprised if that wasn't the case. Yeah.
And working on resilient, sustainable societies in the Arctic, are you doing mostly qualitative research interviews?
Actually, the majority of our research is qualitative. Yeah, the interviews. We have over 80 hours of interview materials that we need to analyze from the 3 case studies. I
wonder how you integrate items like, let's say, we have seen there in some of the slides that some of those interview partners obviously value the tourism very highly.
Yes.
And of course, tourism brings an income. That's a value of the one whale industry, whale watching industry. How do the interview partners see the future of tourism in Iceland, given the fact that we might see after 5 or 10 or 15 years a CO2 quota, let's say a CO2 quota that hurts, flight traffic might go back, and especially cruise tourism might go back dramatically.
I think, particularly in whale watching, they seem to be quite blind to the possibilities of change in the future. There seems to be an assumption that the current situation, which is quite good, is going to continue. And we ask them sometimes, have you considered that climate change might mean that whales do not come to Skjavandi Bay in the north of Iceland in the future, and that you might not have a whale watching industry? And at first, this sounds to them quite extreme. But then we tell them the case study relatively recently of Tromsø in northern Norway, where whales suddenly started to appear in 2013 and 2014. And within 12 months, there were 40 operators conducting whale watching trips into the fjords there, and with no regulation. But then climate change meant that the herring went further north, 4 hours further north to Skjervøy, and all of those 40 operators have now had to stop those activities. And now whale watching opens up in the new community. So things are changing rapidly. So people should be aware that the future is risky, and they need to maybe diversify some.
My question is more methodological. How do you integrate in your research those possibilities that might not be at all, those interview partners might not be aware of at all? And they obviously don't seem to be aware of it.
Well, first of all, we ask them how they perceive things like climate change and these risks. But then, of course, as I say, many of them are not so aware. So then we have to rely on the other parts of our project, the people who are doing the climate change analysis. And it's there that we're hopefully going to connect that work to actually think, well, what does this mean in terms of ecosystem services for this community? What might it mean? What might it mean if whales disappear from this community? How could they adapt?
Or tourists disappear.
Or
I
tourists,
think there is some more likeliness that tourists disappear than whales disappear.
Yeah.
Or what do you think?
I think that's possible too. I mean, we've seen I think it's a 20% decline in Iceland just this year compared to last year. In tourism.
Not because of climate change.
No, it's because mainly I think of whale, mainly, but also, I mean, it was always going to go down at some point. But yeah, so. Yeah, any other questions?
I'm just intrigued, going back to the point about sanctions for not respecting the code of conduct. What were the possible sanctions ever considered when the code of conduct was introduced? And was there a discussion with Coast Guard? Or?
No, I don't. That's never been the case that sanctions have been considered. It's always been a voluntary code that people sign up to. It was developed in conjunction with the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and there's certain just standards, general behavioural standards that are expected to be adopted, particularly with regards to the distance boats are from whales and noise and those kind of things.
So you're just appealing to, well, not you, but I mean the code of conduct mechanism is appealing to kind of enlightened self-interest, alter whale watching.
Yeah, I guess it's on the basis that it's in their best interest to adopt a policy such as this, and having such a policy is also very good for their corporate social responsibility too. So, but it seems that the benefits of breaking those voluntary regulations seem to be more than the costs, certainly based on the experience of what you were saying. Yeah.
But has there been any research what the tourists are thinking about it? I mean, they're not all stupid idiots. If we would ask them what is more important for you to get as close to the whale as possible, or to do the whale watching in an appropriate and sustainable manner, what would you value higher as a tourist? I would.
When we've interviewed the whale watching guides in Husavik, we've asked them, so do people complain? We've observed that you'll get quite close to the whales, and maybe this is against the rules. And they say that less than 2% of the tourists are sufficiently upset to complain, or so perhaps they don't understand the regulations, or perhaps they're so happy to have got up close to a whale and had a beautiful picture or something like that, that's more important to them.
Or they would go home and mumble and complain about it, but not complain to the actual tour operator.
Yeah, or put something on TripAdvisor and say something like that.
Rant on Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. I don't know what you found, but I've certainly found little evidence that tourists are complaining about this.
I didn't even work on the boat, but some people could tell that I was a researcher and that I wasn't just a tourist. And I had a couple people over 3 months express their concerns about how close we were or how many boats were around a whale. And also what I noticed is some guides do mention the code of conduct during their opening speech on the boat, and they point out on the door, here's the code of conduct, you can come and read it. But then during the whole tour, they're actively breaking it while they're promoting it. So it's quite interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
Is that used at all in marketing by these companies? Are they like putting on their websites, we are
It's in their
steeled
brochures.
sand?
So they promote sustainable whale watching is what they say their company strives for. And then they have the code of conduct in their brochure. But if you go out, they don't follow it.
So it's actively being used.
Yeah.
For
It's a marketing tool, I guess.
Yeah, it
Whereas,
is.
it's in conflict with the reality of human nature, which is that we all want the best Instagram shot to go around, right? So,
Yeah, so the risk to the company would be to not to sign up to it, at least on paper or online, as they do. So
I think that might also reduce complaints in terms of if you're actively showing that this is what we're doing, we're following these rules. There's that inherent bias of just trusting the authorities. And like,
that's true.
We can get as close as we want. They understand. They're the experts. They're following the rules, as opposed to. So maybe that's.
Yeah. Indeed. Okay. Well,
One question on equity.
yes.
You mentioned the word equity. What does this mean in terms of those two whaling industries, the whale hunting and the whale watching, or the whale eating and the whale watching industries?
It's a good question. Well, one example of issues to do with fairness, equity in relation to whale watching, maybe again in Husavik, is the fact of how the guides are treated, actually, what we found in our research. And that the guides are often very well educated, they speak many languages, and they come here, they earn a low wage, and they also live very often in substandard housing, converted housing that shouldn't be housing. So they are exploited to some degree. This is true in Husavik. To some extent it's true in Andenes, less so, I would say. In terms of equity in Greenland linked to the hunting, an example would be the contribution of indigenous hunters to the quota setting for whaling. And they would feel that their information, their just traditional knowledge, just from being out there and experiencing the environment, their traditional knowledge is not factored in or considered during the quota setting process. And they feel quite disenfranchised because the people who come and set the quota are often Danish scientists who spend very little time in Greenland. And they are often remote from them. They operate maybe in an office in Nuuk for the period they're there, and they don't go and seek their advice about what would be a sensible quota level and whether it should be raised or not. And often the quotas have been the same in Greenland for more than 10 years. So.
But I mean, one aspect of, to my mind, equity, but I don't know whether this would be part of the concept of equity, is that the Icelandic state has put money in the 80s to Hafrannsóknastofnun, to Marine Research Institute, to find out how much of biomass is there, like with the other harvestable species in the sea, and how much can be taken out without compromising the stocks.
Yes.
So in this respect, the whales are treated like other species in the sea.
Like a fish.
Like the fish, and in future also like the algae. But there was allocated money for that, that is only serving one of the whale industries, not the other. So this is tax money. This is put into research, but there is no research on the others.
There's no direct, for instance, financial support to whale watching companies to set up a business, to maintain a business. That's true. That's an important equity consideration too. Absolutely, the inequality in terms of who is supported. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
For the indigenous hunters, did any of them ever express? They expressed their frustration with the quota system, but did they express any of that leading to illegal hunting of whales?
We didn't find any evidence of illegal hunting of whales, and I suppose if they are conducting it, they wouldn't have told us. Imagine, in case we're journalists.
They're very trusting.
Yeah.
Very trusting.
No, we didn't find any evidence of that. Sorry, what was your first point again? The first point?
They were just out of frustration through the quota system.
Some of them are definitely frustrated and would rather go back to the previous system where they could essentially hunt as much as they want. And they think, based on the evidence they see in some cases, that for certain species, they should be able to do that, like bowhead whales and things in Disco Bay. But so they are dissatisfied in many cases. But we also saw examples where hunters said they thought the current system was fine. Their biggest concern that they expressed was the way in which the younger generation were not so interested in hunting and didn't respect the older generation's expertise. That was the biggest concern that we found among them. So.
Good. Now I see our time is over, unfortunately.
Okay.
I think there would be many more questions, and you're welcome to continue the discussion, but we formally end this discussion and also end the streaming now. Thank you, David
Thank you very
Cook,
much.
for being here in Vísindaport at the University Center of the Westfjords.
Thank you.
More questions if you have.